Welcome to our first meeting of 2023. I'm Erin Frigo. I'm the president of the Panhandle Archaeological Society, and our speaker tonight is Steve Kaighen, who will be discussing metal artifacts from a post-Mexican war camp, Leavenworth County, Kansas, 1848 to 1851. To minimize interference, I do ask that everyone mute themselves. Just again, that just minimizes interference. It makes sure that we're not hearing different voices or echoes over our speaker. We like to save, you can unmute yourselves for questions if you would like. If you don't know how to mute yourself, it's okay. Once I give the floor to Steve, I can see who's not muted and I will mute your speaker for you. And with that, I give the floor to you, Steve.
All right, thank you very much, Erin. Now, do I click down here at the bottom, share screen?
Yes.
Okay. Screen 2. Do you see that, Erin? The metal artifacts?
I do. You're coming in clear.
All right. Well, I will go ahead and get started. Hello, everyone. My name is Steve Kaighen. Tonight, we'll go over two different camps. The first is an 1848 post-Mexican War era camp that I discovered back in 2015 in Leavenworth County, Kansas, on private property and with landowners' permission. Now, over a period of 7 years, I was able to document the placements of these artifacts and to determine where the officer had camped, where the enlisted soldier camped, and where the Indian guide had camped. I also was able to find additional features showing where they had tethered the horses and where they had parked a wagon that was loaded with tools, by the way. And as best I can tell, this was an overnight camp. And with artifacts showing signs of heavy wear, I can only assume that they had just returned from a very long trip. Now, the second portion of this presentation will go over a 1869 post-Civil War camp, where in 2018 I was invited by Texas archaeologist Scott Brzezowski to help in a survey project in Hays, Kansas. Now, this camp was occupied by General George A. Custer and the 7th Cavalry, and it was quite an honor and a privilege to be able to get to help out on this project. So with that, let's go ahead and get started with this presentation. The question I get asked the most, how do you find military camps on a regular basis? And to answer that question, I have found that over the years, the best source of information are from eyewitness accounts. People who were actually there, people who can give a good descriptive and detailed report of not only the land, but the people around them. Now, these can be found in the form of a personal journal, diaries, books, documents, maps, and with a lot of hard work, and I do mean a lot of hard work, one can find these incredible places that were lost in history. My studies, findings, and documentations as it relates to early military history have always been centered around U.S. Dragoon activity, leaving Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, starting in 1834. Let me move this just a second. There we go. Starting in 1834, under the commands of Colonel Henry Dodge, Stephen Watts Kearney, and Lieutenant Colonel John C. Fremont. Also, Captain Howard Stansbury of the Topographical Corps of Engineers and the Cheyenne Expedition of 1857. Now, my all-time favorite book is 5 Years a Dragoon, and I'll just show it to you right here. This book here was written by Percival G. Lowe, who he himself was a first sergeant of Troop B, 1st Dragoon, and he served between 1849 and 1854 at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. Now here's another book. Now someone once told me years ago, Steve, if there was ever one book that you only need to unlock the history of Kansas, it would be this book. The Beginning of the West, Annals of the Kansas Gateway to the American West. Now this was written by Louise Berry. She did a phenomenal job on this particular book. It was a foundational start for me because what it allowed me to do, the information that she gave, I was able to build from that and resort to other books to help me find these early military camps. So The Beginning of the West is a phenomenal book to study. And then of course, my own documentations are kept in my personal journal and through pictures and video. Now I'll share with you, here is my personal journal that I have kept over the years. In fact, my son gave this journal to me on Father's Day in 2008, 15 years ago. And I continued to document all the military camps that I had found through the years. And I'd like to share just a few of the camps that I had found documented in this journal. The first camp that I documented was Camp Sumner, just outside of Fort Leavenworth. That camp was found by researching this book right here, The March of the Mounted Riflemen. Extraordinary book. This was written by Raymond Settle, S-E-T-T-L-E, a phenomenal book to study military history. But in the back of it, they actually give a copy of the diary of George Gibbs. And in that diary, as you open up the book, he devotes a chapter called March from Fort Leavenworth to Fort Kearney. And in that chapter, he describes in detail mileage and the location of Camp Sumner. Now, it took me a while to find the camp, but I finally found it, and it was based off of this book here. As I continue to look through my journal, I have documented a trading post that I had found back in 2010, but we're going to save that for another presentation because there's a lot of information about that. It's a pretty cool site. Another site was the Cheyenne Expedition of 1857. Now, here's another book, Cheyenne and the Horse Soldiers, an excellent book. This was written by William Chalfant. I believe that's how you pronounce that last name. Extraordinary book. I was following the column of Colonel Sumner's and his troops, which were the 1st and 2nd Cavalry, trying to locate his military camps northwest of Fort Leavenworth. They gave good mileage and they gave a name of a creek. But I spent 4 years trying to find this camp that's mentioned in this book, and I never found it. But what I did find through looking for four long years was many other military camps in the area. Now, it wasn't like I was constantly looking for that one particular camp. No, it was any time that when I was out in that area, I would at least devote a half a day and try to search for this other camp of Colonel Sumner of the 1st and 2nd Cavalry, but I never found it. And then as I continue in my journal, in the very back, I have documented all the property owners who had given me permission over the years. I'll just say this, a journal is a must, especially doing this type of a hobby where as the years go by, you think that you can remember certain things. And I even videotape a lot of my findings or a lot of my camps, still, I have to resort back to this journal, because in this journal, I have written specific detailed reports and drawings of military camps that I have found, and the placement of those artifacts where they're found in the camps, and just good solid information that I can always resort back to. So highly recommend to do a journal. And of course, all these studies have produced over 34 never before found pre-Civil War military camps found in Northeast Kansas. I did a material artifact summary of this particular camp that we're going to talk about tonight. There were 116 pieces of brass found in this camp. Now, only 14 modern shotgun shells were found. That's a rather low amount. And in fact, as far as modern trash, 0. There was no modern homes found in this location, no modern roads. It was deep in heavy woods. There was only one piece of silver found, and that was in the form of a silver brooch. There was no gold found in the camp, at least not in this camp. 267 pieces of iron, 120 of those with square nails, and we're going to talk about square nails in a few minutes. Very important. 98 pieces of lead, only 2 69 caliber 3-ring Manet balls were found in this camp. The rest were small caliber lead round balls. Only one piece of copper kettle or copper was found in the camp. That was in the form of a copper kettle patch that I'll show here in a moment. 8 pewter trouser buttons, 15 pieces of refined earthenware, 1 sliver of glass, and 1 stone scraper, for a total of 508 pieces found in this camp. Now, I also did an inventory list by name and quantity, just to give you guys an idea of what was found in this camp. And it's quite amazing, actually. There were 29 horseshoes found, 7 mule shoes, 1 ox shoe. Now, this is very important because this ox shoe was found in the feature where the wagon was parked. And this wagon was full of tools that was scattered all over in this tightly concentrated area. I had found in that area 5 files, 1 adze, a hot iron, a couple of padlock plates, 5 axe heads, a small hatchet head, 2 iron spikes, and the small fireplace shovel was actually found where the officer had camped. And then over here on this side where the miscellaneous is, I only found 19 military buttons in the whole entire camp. That's a small number. The majority of them were U.S. Dragoon buttons. There was 1 artillery button found, and there were a few U.S. greatcoat buttons found. And then as we just scan down the list, a lot of interesting artifacts were found. Right here, we've got a beaver trap. I've been able to identify it as a Miles Standish 1834 trap. Very unique. You'll see that here in a moment. And also a lot of other interesting items. Now, conservation. I spend a great deal of time in preserving artifacts, especially when it does come to iron. Now, my goal has always been long-term preservation. And in these 2 photos on the left, these were taken at a different site, recently discovered. But here I have a small trade hatchet found lying right on top of the ground. And as I hold the object in my hand, you can actually see the corrosion buildup from years of exposure to moisture, air, and chemicals from the field. But then by applying electrolysis, I'm now able to show a good representation of what this artifact may have looked like in its original form. And it certainly is something that we can enjoy and appreciate for years to come. Now, it would be impossible to show all the artifacts found from this camp, but here are just a few, and I've separated them into categories. In the upper left corner, this is all related to the animal-related equipment, such as your curry comb, horseshoe, mule shoe, a couple of interesting horse bits made out of iron, a brass stirrup. Now this is unique because right here where the slit is, where the leather would slide through, the top portion is almost completely worn completely through. And we have a couple of buckles. We have an iron buckle here and a silver-plated ornate horse buckle here and a snaffle bit. In this corner over here in the upper right corner, we have pieces to an early weapon. These were found in the feature where the Indian guide had camped. And what I found there was a brass butt plate along with the screw that would have fit in the hole right here. And we have a very unique brass patchbox lid cover. Now this design I actually found on the internet. It was actually attached an exact photo of an 1822 Jacob Dickard, Pennsylvania long rifle. So it kind of gives you an idea of the possibility of how old this weapon might have been. Then of course, right here, we have brass pieces to a nose called a nose cap. It would have been on the end of the barrel of the gun. We have a lead round ball. And here we have a very unique piece. This is called a breech plug. But someone took great pains into disassembling this weapon and taking a file and carving a notch out of the threads right here, rendering this breech plug completely useless. I've never seen that before in all my years. And then of course, the ornaments. We have a couple of brass hawk bells, a silver brooch, and here's that beaver trap, Miles Standish 1834 beaver trap, complete with the chain, and then a very interesting copper kettle piece, and it still has some rivets left in it. Down here in the bottom left corner, we have items that were recovered from the enlisted and the officers' camp. Now right here we have, it's either a major or a lieutenant colonel's insignia badge. You take a magnifying glass and you can actually see in the crevices some silver gilt. So it's either a major or a lieutenant colonel. Here we have an iron from a carbine sling belt swivel right here. And this brass piece would have fit on the end of that carbine belt buckle. Then we have an epaulette or a shoulder scale. And the buttons consisted of artillery, U.S. greatcoat button, and a U.S. Dragoon button. And then over here, we have a couple of presidential campaign tokens that I'll talk about later in the presentation. And then this last picture over here, this is where the wagon was parked. Now it's very interesting. In this feature, I found an ox shoe right here. Well, this ox was pulling a heavy wagon from evidence of this very large and heavy hand-forged I guess it's called a kind of a cotter pin, I guess you would call it, made by a blacksmith. And there's a unique lip applied to the very end. And then, of course, large hooks and heavy chains and an ox yoke harness. And then, of course, all the tools found in the area. A hatchet, a couple of files, tools, and like I had mentioned earlier, an adze, a shovel, and lots of axe heads. Now, I've never shown this picture before, so you guys are the first one to ever see this picture. This is the view of the campsite that I found. And as you can tell, it's in a heavy, heavy woods. But we do have a feature right in front of us. If you look real close, there is a sunken road right here. Now this road measures approximately 10 foot wide, 4 feet deep, and it goes 233 yards across this particular stretch of property. And yes, the same trail does reappear on another trail, or on another piece of property, I'm sorry. And yes, with another camp, by the way. Now this trail is an unnamed trail. And it's based off of an 1839 map that I found. It was drawn by First Lieutenant A.R. Johnston of the 1st Regiment of U.S. Dragoons. Now in this photo, we're looking due south, but this trail actually goes in a northwest direction. And we're actually standing in the position right here where the officers had camped. So to give us a better idea, let's walk down to the bottom of this hill right here, and let's look straight up this trail in a northwest direction. So we were standing up here where the officers' camp was, and we walked down the trail, and now we're looking in a northwest direction. You can actually see the contour of the land. Excuse me. I'm hearing a lot of noise, music in the background. Well, anyway, hopefully you can hear me. But you can actually see the contour of the land on the left-hand side of this picture. It's kind of high, and then the land drops down and then swings back up and rises on this side. This trail is right in front of us. As the trail goes to the top of the hill, it flattens out and it continues on down to the backside of the other hill, or on the other side. Now on the north side of this trail right here, this is where the officers' camp is located. Further north of that location is where they tethered the horses. Now hop over onto the south side of this trail, and this is where the enlisted soldiers camped over here. Further west of them is where the wagon was parked that was loaded with tools. And a little further west of them is where the Indian guide had camped. So as I stood back, I began to record all these features and recorded it in my journal. So I'm going to show you a picture inside my journal that I have created. Now, please don't laugh. This is my personal way of recording these, where the placement of these artifacts are. But this is a way for me to understand or to keep record of where these artifacts are found. So we were standing right down here in the sunken road area, and we were looking in a northwesterly direction. As you go up to the top of the hill, the trail actually splits, and it goes along the side of the hill, and then it reconnects back to the main trail and continues on down to the back side of the hill. Now, the reason why I think they split right here is because this area is very flat. And in fact, this is where they had parked the wagon that was full of tools. So when it would rain, I would guess that this area became real muddy. So they simply just made a detour around along the edge. And it actually created an island right here. And this island can actually still be seen today in the woods. So also to try to make sense of what I've done is I have created, you'll notice right here, this is a tight concentration of where I had marked artifacts that were found, and I have used numbers. Now, these numbers, if we go over here on this page, the numbers with a circle represent iron. Numbers with a triangle represent a brass object. So to give you an idea, let's look at this triangle right here with the number 22. Well, since it's a triangle, I know it's made of brass. So I go over here to the brass column and go clear down to number 22. And I've actually got it labeled as a lieutenant colonel's insignia badge. Let's look at another one. Number 20 with a circle. Well, circle, I know that it's made of iron. So I go to the iron column and I go clear down to number 20, and it is an iron stirrup. Now also keep in mind, you might see an X with a circle. That's an iron target, but it represents square nails, multiple square nails, and that's very important. And then let's look at one more feature, this feature right here. Let's look at a couple of numbers. Number 11 with a circle. Let's go down to number 11, that's a watering bit. Number 12, a horseshoe. 13, a horse bit. Let's look at 15. That's where I found a curry comb. So I began to find a lot of artifacts related to horses, and they always parked the horses next to where the officers' camp was. So now you kind of get an idea of how I drew this map up. Now, over the years, I have enjoyed participating in artifact shows in Kansas and Nebraska, where I display artifacts that were found in this camp. So what I've done is I've actually redrawn this map to show the public the layout of this camp. But when I show this drawing, I get a lot of people asking me, how do you determine the location of a campfire when using a metal detector? Because I've got labeled here 3 different campfires. To answer that question, I tell them there are 3 specific things that I look for when searching for patterns inside camps. Number 1, a tight concentration of square nails. Now, square nails to me are the number 1 artifact that I'm looking for when trying to establish a pattern within a camp. They not only help identify the parameters of a camp, but they also help identify certain features inside that camp. Number 2, inside these tight features, you will most likely find small specks of black ash, indicating a fire. Number 3, small chunk rock, no bigger than the size of your fist. Now these were placed around the fire. And I've actually got right here an example of a small chunk rock found in this feature. Now you may not be able to see this in the woods that well, but in a plowed field, these small chunk rock are very obvious if you know what you're looking for. You'll see an unusual outcropping of these small chunk rock in areas that it doesn't belong. And so these are the secrets that I observe when looking for patterns inside a military camp. Now, I'm always on the lookout for objects found in the camp that give good reference to the current event. Now, this can help determine how old the camp might be. Here we have an 1848 Henry Clay presidential campaign token, which is made of brass. Now, in 1839, Clay was running for presidency, believe it or not, for a third straight time. He went on to give a speech on the Senate floor expressing his opposition to the abolitionist movement, and this speech may have cost him the support of anyone who was opposed to slavery, which is why he said, quote, "I would rather be right than be president," end quote. But it also is important to note that Henry Clay condemned slavery, but yet at the same time, he owned slaves. Here's another example that would give reference to the current event. This is an 1849 Lewis Cass and William Butler campaign presidential token. Now, Lewis Cass represented the state of Michigan in the United States Senate. He also was a leading spokesperson for the doctrine of popular sovereignty, which held that the people in each territory should decide whether to permit slavery. And for reasons unknown, the face of this token right here was found partially stripped, exposing a twine substance right here, which I thought was rather interesting. Now here we have several pieces found inside the enlisted soldiers camp right here. Now these pieces go to a model 1832 stovepipe shako hat, as pictured right here. Now this style cap was used until 1851, when it was replaced by the Albert's cap. Now there was only one artillery button found in the entire camp. Now if we flip that button over, we can actually see right here that this is a two-piece button. It has a full complete shank. It has raised marks in a depressed channel. Now those raised marks spell out W.H. Horstman, Philadelphia. Now with that manufacturer's mark, I can identify this particular button dating between 1820 to 1840s. And also I had found a couple of, a pair of buttons found together. And in my opinion, these have somewhat of a design of a bomb burst design. And if you flip the buttons over, you'll see there's iron residue on the back right here, which I believe were attached to a cap. Now I have found a lot of buttons over the years, but I have never seen this particular pattern right here. So to me, these are quite rare. Found in the 1851 regulations, signed by Adjutant General Roger Jones, right here, in June of 1851, they show a drawing here in the regulations of an epaulet for all enlisted men of the Dragoon and Light Artillery. And notice the unique clipped corners on this epaulet. Well, in this camp, I had discovered an exact full complete epaulet as described in the 1851 regulations. And that's why I had to include a date for this camp to be as late as 1851. Now, I can talk all day long on the forensic study of ammunition. It's a fun subject, and if you study these features on a bullet, you can actually determine if a bullet was either dropped or fired. And if it was fired, does it show ramrod marks, or how about land and groove marks? All this can provide a wealth of information, not only about the bullet itself, but also the weapon that fired it. So here we have a fired 50 caliber lead round ball. But here we also see the impressions of a patch that was wrapped around the ball when fired. So now I'm able to identify this bullet as being fired from a smooth bore 50 caliber weapon. Here we have an artifact with the manufacturer's name stamped on the inside of a brass side plate that would have been mounted on the side of a weapon. The name is John P. Moore. Now he's listed as owning a gun shop in New York City from as early as 1820 to 1850, giving us an idea of how old this brass side plate is. For 7 years, the property owner allowed me to return to this site multiple times until finally he moved away and permission was no longer available. Now, while it is impossible to know exactly who occupied the camp and why so many artifacts were left behind, still questions do remain. Number one, based on that major or lieutenant colonel's insignia badge, why was such a high-ranking officer, why would he be in charge of such a small number of soldiers, which I estimate to be only about 10 to 15 soldiers in the camp? Number two, why was there such a large amount of material left behind? Now, the officer in charge, he had the responsibility of not only charging out this material, but also the safe return of it as well. But the evidence showed he wasn't concerned with this at all, nor was he concerned with uniform regulations, in my opinion, which I find extremely odd. You know, there's an old saying, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Well, through my research, I found a picture from an artist, his name, James Abbott, who traveled with Lieutenant Colonel John C. Fremont on one of his expeditions while traveling through the Cristobal Mountains of New Mexico. And in that drawing, he shows a column of 8 soldiers riding horses being led by an Indian guide. It also shows just 1 wagon and 1 artillery piece that was being pulled by a horse and carriage. It also shows 1 ordnance officer who just so happens to be wearing a stovepipe shako cap. And then, of course, there's Fremont, who's at the end of the column, riding a horse, pulling a packed mule with his equipment. Now, not to say that the camp I found has any connection with the James Abbott drawing, but it does show some very interesting similarities. And with that, I conclude the first half of this presentation. So I'll open it up to any questions that might be related to this camp.
Sir,
Yes.
that brooch is very interesting in that it's not representative of a Plains Indian. It's a Great Lakes style item, and it would have been worn by somebody such as a Stack and Fox, Winnebago, and of course, those people became displaced and were no longer living, at that period in the Great Lakes area, but had moved on down south. And that Delawares, for instance, would wear that kind of thing. And they were sort of typical even of Texas. So that's kind of interesting. And some of the other artifacts might be representative of where those natives came from.
Well, thank you very much for sharing that. I personally, well, here, I'll show something here. When I read this article, Warriors for the Union, it was a fantastic article written by Deborah Nichols and Lawrence Hopman. It really gave me an awareness of the Delaware Indians who were in this area during this period. And it has been documented that the soldiers used the Delaware as Indian scouts many times. And I've actually read documents on that. So that's interesting that you say that. Also, I will say a lot of the material, just like you said, it predates the actual date of the camps. And so that was really interesting that you mentioned that.
I've heard it said by somebody more knowledgeable than me that the Indians more eastern were actually fiercer than Plains Indians because they had 100 years head start on how to battle against their enemies and white people. So at any rate, the Delawares made excellent scouts and whatnot.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that.
Hey, Steve, I just want to let you know there is a question in the comments. It's from Tim Durham. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It says, are there any records that show that Fremont traveled through that area headed west?
Absolutely, there is. I'll share one quick little thing, and I don't want to take too long on it. There's actually court documents that John C. Fremont was brought back from California under arrest by Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny back to Fort Leavenworth. But they would not allow Fremont to camp on the premises of Fort Leavenworth. They were trying to humiliate him, and they said that he had to camp outside the fort. And so in these court documents that I have found in the congressional series, they actually, believe it or not, state Fremont's camp. And they give mileage. But to answer your question, yes, there is documentation that Fremont went right through this area.
Thank you, Steve. So it looks like Tim might have been kicked out for a little while. I don't know if he heard the whole answer you just gave, but to Tim, I would like to state that this is being recorded. So if you would like to go look at listen to your answer, you can do that after this presentation. Sorry about that, Tim.
That's okay. Thank you. Any other questions before I go on?
I have another question.
Sure.
Square nails covers a pretty wide variety. Even horseshoes are nails or square nails, but you don't mean horseshoe nails when you say square nails, do you?
I do not. And in fact, you can do a whole study on square nails. I mean, it's fascinating. What I'm referring to, most likely in these tight, concentrated areas, I would suspect that they dismantled crates that were nailed together with square nails. So it's those type of square nails that I'm referring to, and not horseshoe.
Like medium size.
Yep, sure. But there's a fascinating study on square nails. And like I say, that is my #1 target as an avocational when I'm out looking for camps. In fact, I pray that I find a concentration of square nails, because when I begin to hear multiple signals in an area, I know I am about to, come upon a feature.
Thank you.
You bet. All right. I'll continue on. Now this second camp, this is real interesting. This is the Fort Hays project. Now this occurred March 2nd through the 4th in 2018 in Ellis County, Kansas, just south of Hays, Kansas. This is a General George A. Custer and the 7th Cavalry Camp that dates 1869, so it's post-Civil War. Project coordinator was Nancy Arndt, and I apologize if I don't pronounce that last name correctly. And then also Texas archaeologist Scott Brzezowski out of Perrington, Texas, He's the one who actually invited me to participate as a surveyor in this project. And the objective of this was to survey the area and just gather more data. Metal detectorists were needed to locate and record artifacts found in this field. Now, the recovery instructions were very simple. When we got out there, we were to bag and flag the small objects, such as the picture right here. The larger objects we were to flag and leave next to the hole. And then colored flags were used to mark their location. Now, for that survey project, I chose the color blue for my flags. And here I actually am showing a picture of my White's MXT that I used for that event. And if you notice, it's coupled with a very small 6x10 elliptical search coil. Now that's because I'm not interested in depth at all. Instead, I'm more interested in target separation. And this is a good coil to use for that. I also have, you see this white probe that's attached? It's actually called an inline probe, which actually, it's a mini detector. So once you open the hole with the shovel, you stick the probe, this white probe, into the hole, and it helps you to locate precisely where the target is without damaging the artifact. And I highly recommend this. Either have an inline probe or a handheld probe, but you're going to save the artifact from getting damaged. On day one, we all arrived out on the project site and we lined our vehicles up along the road. And Nancy gave our day's instructions of what we were to do for that day. If you look to the east of where we parked, this picture right here, this is the field for the project. The tree line represents Big Creek, and we're just south of Fort Hays. Now, I immediately notice that it's a plowed field, or they're actually planting in the field. I wish I would have taken a picture at the end of the day, because there were multiple flags throughout this entire field. I don't know how many targets were found, but it literally looked like a Christmas tree. And I know the people driving on the highway were looking over and they were like, what in the world is going on? But it was a sight to behold. On day two, it was cold, but we had clear skies. Here I am standing next to the Custer Island Park Monument, and Scott had taken a picture of me standing next to it. Now, if you look due east of this monument, you will see in between the two trees an elevated field right here. Well, in this field, this is where Scott and I performed a preliminary survey of the area. So let's take a walk over into this field right over here, and I'll show you what we see. So here I'm standing east of the monument, but in a different field. And the first thing I notice, the field has not been plowed at all. It's being used for cattle to graze in. But the unique feature about this area is that the tree line right here goes in a horseshoe shaped. So it covers, so actually there's water that covers 3 sides of this field. Now, if you turn around and do an about face and look due south, you see higher elevated ground and you see a power lines. Now let me move my deal right here. And over in this right corner, you can actually see where we parked our vehicles. Now, when I'm looking for camps, I always start walking with my detector in a zigzag motion. In other words, I will start at one end of the field. I will walk all the way to the other field, swinging the detector. I'll drop down 10 feet and do an about face and walk back to the other side of the field in a straight line. Drop down 10 feet and repeat the process until I cover the complete field. Now, I've actually got this down to a science over the years because I can effectively cover about 80 acres of land in about 4 hours and be able to tell if anything significant is found in that particular piece of property. So as Scott and I began our preliminary search of this area, we turned our detectors on and I began to walk that pattern. When I got over here to the left-hand corner of the field, right here, I got my first signal, and this is what I found. The picture on the right, I'm holding a beautiful flower-designed brooch. Now look in the background. See that probe? That's that white probe I was talking about. Once I open the hole up with the shovel, I always use this because look how fragile this artifact is, and it would be easily to damage. So you have got to always use this probe to precisely pinpoint where that target is. And the end result is a beautiful brooch. And then of course the picture on the right, here's my good buddy Scott. He's wearing his usual khaki shorts and a t-shirt, but I might add, this is a cold and frigid day. But he's holding that brooch right here in his hands. But look over on his, just to the right of his shoulder, right here. Here we see the Custer Park Monument. So we're actually standing due east of that monument. And so that's just to give you an idea of the location of where this brooch was found. Now, the best part of all this was that after the brooch was cleaned and processed, it showed up on the Kansas Historic Society's website called Kansas Memory, which, by the way, is an excellent website. And I encourage everyone to visit this site. They did a real good job. They give a brief description about the brooch and where it was found, which I thought was very, very nice. They also said that Elizabeth Bacon Custer joined her husband, George Custer, whenever possible at the 7th Cavalry Camp, and perhaps this brooch belonged to her. Now, I have to say this, there were many other officers' wives in the camps as well. But it sure would be nice to dream a little, to think that it might be hers, but highly unlikely. Getting back to the field that we were searching, and we're looking due south, I continued after finding the brooch over here. I continued to do the zigzag motion, back and forth, until I got in this area right here. I started to hear multiple signals in this area. Now, I've learned over the years that anytime you get multiple signals, you need to slow down because you're about to discover a feature within the camp. So I dug the very first target in that multiple signal area, and I'm looking down in the hole, and I see this. Any guesses as to what this might be?
A tether.
Correct. We're looking down upon a picket pin that was actually left in its original position for over 150 years. Amazing. Now, as I continue to dig around this picket pin, what I did is I laid the shovel over the hole and measured from the shovel handle down to the top of the picket pin, and it measured 6 inches deep. So this picket pin actually went down below grade 6 inches in 150 years or 150 plus years. So I went over to Todd, who was one of the archaeologists standing nearby, and I gave that information to him. And here I'm actually holding the picket pin just to show how long these can actually be. In some cases, 18 to 24 inches long. Now, as I stood back, I took a picture of this area where I had placed the picket pin right here, and I marked it with a flag, and I refilled the hole. But as I stood back, I'm looking at my flags, and I ended up staying at this location the entire day because I started to find multiple signals, as you can see from multiple flags in the area. They were all being concentrated in a tight area. And as I said before, anytime you have a tight concentration of artifacts, you're about to find a feature. And as the day went on and the sun began to somewhat settle in the west, shadows began to form on the ground. And I don't know about you, but I certainly see a large rectangular shape depression in the soil or in the field right here. And it just so happens that this picket pin is located right at the corner of this feature. Now, I'll let the archaeologists and the professionals interpret what this is, but I do have my suspicions. And then I walked over here to Todd, who was one of the archaeologists, hard at work. He's gathering all the information and putting the artifacts in the bucket. I walked over to him and I looked due north, looked this direction, and I saw something really interesting. So I took a picture of it. So I'm standing next to Todd and we're looking due north in the field. I'm looking at the surveyors and I'm thinking, this is very strange. There's no surveyors to the right and there's no surveyors to the left, but they're all concentrated in a straight line clear to the tree line. Especially these guys right here. They were busy all day long in this area. And I was very curious. So I went down to take a look to see what they were finding. They were busy digging these large trash pits in the area. Ration cans, cow bones, you name it. All kinds of stuff was being recovered. And as we know, these can provide a wealth of information as it relates to the period of occupation. But I would be curious to know if any of the paper labels ever survived on the ration cans. Now that would be neat to see. Many artifacts were recovered from this site, including bullets and buttons. Now, for the enlisted soldier, they used a button with a letter on the shield to indicate the branch of service. This lasted until 1854, when it was replaced by a general service eagle button with no letter on the shield, as indicated in this picture right here. But the officers, they continued to use the old style button with the letter on the shield until the year 1902, when it was replaced by the Great Seal button for all ranks. Therefore, being that this was an 1869 camp, I can identify this button as being an officer's infantry button. Now the next three pictures represent a Spencer cartridge bullet. Now by measuring the base of the cartridge from here to here, which measures 0.56, and then measuring the mouth of the cartridge from here to here, 0.50, we have a 5650 Spencer cartridge. And if you turn the cartridge over, you'll see three letters, SAW. Now this represents Sage Ammunition Works. This was manufactured out of Middletown, Connecticut. We also have another cartridge with JG, which represents Jacob Goldmark. And this was manufactured out of New York from the year 1864 to 1866. And as you can tell from the firing pin impression, this cartridge has been fired. Now, there were many people involved in this project, and we all had a blast, including myself. And I was able to meet and get acquainted with a lot of people that had the same passion as I did. But more importantly, we were able to recover and save artifacts from a very important historic site. And with that, I conclude the presentation. So are there any questions?
Thank you so much, Steve. If anyone has a question, you are welcome to unmute at this time. Or you can come up. No? No questions? No?
So Steve, how long have you been metal detecting?
Since 13 years old.
Oh, wow.
Long time. When I first started, it was just like with anyone else. You're always interested in just finding something. But it wasn't until about 17 years old that I really began to get involved with locating early military history. And being that I live in Kansas City, you have Fort Leavenworth to the north of me, about 39 miles. You have Fort Scott to the south of me, about 90 something miles. And then of course, Fort Riley, which is west of me, about, I don't know, 250 something miles. Well, I'm smack in the middle. So I have a lot of military involvement just in my area. So I've enjoyed many years of looking for early military camps.
Just to let you know, Steve, you have a couple of just some compliments from Tim Durham. He says, awesome presentation, thank you. And from Marcus Brendel, great job presenting and love the detail.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Just curious, you said you've been metal detecting since you were 13 or so?
13.
Is that what you said? Okay.
Yes.
So do you have like is there like a brand that you like more than others? Anything like that?
I'll say this. I use a White's MXT, but as of late, I use a detector called Deus, D-E-U-S.
Okay.
It's a French-made detector. And the reason why I use that, it's very super light. And I'm able to swing that detector all day long without the arm hurting. Whereas the MXT is going to be a little bit heavier, but after a while, I mean, I kid you not, I start from sunrise and end at sunset in some cases. Very long hours I spend out in the fields. And so you want that light detector, and that's what the Deus provides. But I'll say this about detectors. It's not the detector that finds the camps. It's always about the research that you do. And before I ever even go out walking in the fields, I'll do an extensive amount of research to try to narrow the area down so I don't have to do as much walking. So it's the research really that helps you to locate these early military camps versus the detector. Now, the detector, you just want a basic detector that does good target separation, not necessarily depth, because I'll tell you this, most of the artifacts are found 6 inches or less. And believe it or not, in a plowed field, you'll even find it right on top of the ground. So I'm not necessarily interested in depth. I'm more interested in target separation. And so that's what I use.
So just to kind of follow up with that, I did a field school a long time ago where we use metal detectors, and I heard a story of someone who they tried every which way to try to find something, and eventually they realized that it was in like the part of the tree that they were holding. Has anything like that ever happened to you?
I have never had a tree sound off, but I'll
No.
tell you a funny story.
Okay.
And this only happened once. And after that, I've never done it ever again. But when you're out in the fields, well, there's a lot of cattle that roam the fields. Well, they're little cow pies. Your detector will go off. It only took me one time to figure out that they were eating salt tablets or salt blocks. And the salt that they were eating was sounding off the detector. It only happened once, never again.
Yeah, I find that quite often
Okay.
on the
Well,
cow
I'm not the
possums.
only one. I feel good.
No, no. I dug one, and like you said, only once. I didn't dig any more.
But yeah, I do hear cases where people do find bullets embedded in wood, and that's probably quite a common thing, but I haven't ever found that.
Okay. I mean, it was just a funny story. I wondered if you had any funny
Yeah,
stories.
yeah.
So, Jack Farrell has asked, is it convenient to show the Indian artifacts? I would love to make a screen grab and investigate. Do you want me to include your email or send him your email, in fact, to get those pictures, or?
Yes, that would be
Okay.
fine. In fact, right there is my email.
There you
If
go.
you wish to, anyone who wants to comment, please email me. Love to talk. If you have an artifact that is military related, I love to try to identify it, because over the years I have a rather large volume of books on early military items that I love to enjoy studying and researching to try to identify some of these artifacts. So please email me if you have any questions.
Hey,
Let me
Steve, just curious. I'm friends with a guy named Greg Shipley. Do you know that? Do you know him?
That name is very familiar. Very familiar.
He's out of Ohio. He does a lot of Legion, like colonial and pre-colonial research up there. But he's not a trained archaeologist. But I'll tell you, he does a lot more archaeological work than most archaeologists that I've been around. But he's big into the military stuff. So you ought to look at some of his stuff if you're interested in the military side of things, especially that old.
I certainly will. Thank you. Yeah, there's a lot of people.
And I had one question.
Yeah.
I had one question. I think I got booted. I texted it or chatted it earlier, but on the Fremont assumption, I guess, has anybody looked into the records to see if he actually went through that area heading west? Or
I have personally done a ton of research, and yes, Fremont did come right through that area, and I've got a lot of records on that. It's quite an interesting, but I mean, just like with any camp, you can never 100% prove that so and so camped there, but you can certainly search the record.
Unless he dropped his name badge.
Right. Yeah. Right. So I mean, but yeah, there's a lot of records that indicate he was in this area.
So Chris Larson has put in the chat that you should let everybody know about your wonderful YouTube channel where you talk about your metal detecting.
Thank you. I've got probably over 100 videos that I have created, and I started that back in 2008, and I started to recover making videos of camps that I have found over the years. And what I like to do is zoom in and show the artifact being recovered. And I have done that with a lot of early military camps. And I will say this, I'm only 58 years old, but my memory sometimes slips and I forget where I had located something. I'll actually get back onto my YouTube channels, and if I don't have it written in my journal, I can find it on my YouTube and it'll tell me, there it is, I remember. So that's good, you know, that's a good record right there.
So Steve, for people watching your videos, how important would you say it is for metal detectorists to keep a journal and record where their artifacts are found?
I would say it is extremely important. I'll say this, monetary value to me, I mean, these are, I've got a massive collection. The monetary value is nothing to me. It's more about the artifact and the recording of where it was found, because I'll tell you this, there will come a day that I'll pass away. So what have I done? What purpose have I done with these artifacts? Well, by recording these, the next generation will be able to know precisely where these artifacts were found to further their studies if they wish. It is just so important to keep records, detailed records for the next generation.
Thank
Do
you.
you use GPS to locate each artifact?
Never. I never have. And I get asked that quite often. What I do is just mark it down in my journal and in my research papers, precisely where the camp is found. And also on all the display cases that I have, on the back side of that display case, you will not have a problem at finding precisely where that location, where that camp was located, because I have a packet under each display case that shows precisely where these areas are and all the information pertaining to that camp. So GPS, no, but everything else is written on paper.
Okay, thanks. Scott and I usually, we GPS everything down
Right.
and makes it so we can go back. And also the computer allows us to make a computerized map of the whole area.
Awesome. I will say this. I am in the process right now of contacting the Kansas Historic Society in Topeka, Kansas. I want my camps to be recorded. So I am presently, I've actually recorded one site to get a site number. And they always talk about these site numbers. Well, they have actually given me one site number so far, because there's a site that I thought was very important. It was actually a trading post that I had located. Well, I have already given them all the information to the Kansas Historic Society, and they have given me a site number, which I don't have it written down right now, but I can't tell you what the site number is. But that's a way of me of being able to record these sites as well for the future.
Yeah, I enjoyed your presentation very much.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that. Any other questions?
No. All right. Well, thank you so much, Steve. That was a great presentation. We had a great turnout. And thank you so much for coming to speak with us.